First of all, I want to say thank you everybody for joining us today. If you haven't attended one of our webinars in the past, then I'll just give you a quick overview of it. What we like to do is each month we sit down and talk about something that is not necessarily a demonstration of CalcuQuote, but it's really more of a demonstration of what the industry wants to learn. And so today, one of the things that we've been hearing over the past several months, and even even before that, is people want to learn about how to better utilize Excel, since it is probably one of the most commonly used tools or pieces of software that, regardless of which job you have in an EMS company, gets used. So we're going to share some of the best practices, tips, and tricks for how to better use Excel, specifically related to how to do BOM cleanup. Before we move on to that, I'd like to do just share one thing real quick, which is if you haven't been able to attend webinars in the past, you'll be able to see on our blog. So if you go to blog.calcuquote.com, you'll be able to see past webinars that we've conducted. You'll see recordings as well as transcripts of those. So feel free to check that out if you have any time. And you'll see everything related to, primarily related to quoting, pricing, and technology, API, things like that. Okay, without further ado, I will do a quick introduction of myself as well. So my name is Chintan Sutaria. I'm the president of CalcuQuote. I started CalcuQuote a few years ago, and over the course of basically my early career, where I got to work in an EMS company and do quoting as well as a bunch of other things, and through CalcuQuote, where I got to interact with many EMS companies across the United States and Canada. What we like to do here is kind of take advantage of some of the things we're learning through that process and share best practices across the industry. So with that, the way we're going to do today's webinar is a little bit unconventional. Typically, we go through some slides and talk about some concepts and theory and things like that. Instead, for today, what we're going to do is we're actually just going to make it a working session. So I've actually got a spreadsheet where I'm going to go through some examples live, rather than having something that is just a bunch of slides to go through. Okay, so let's move over to our spreadsheet. And so one thing that I want to point out is across the spreadsheet, I've got in the bottom here is a bunch of different tabs, and each tab basically is going to represent something that I'm going to show you. So that's what those tabs are for. Don't feel overwhelmed by that. The other thing is, as many of you may have noticed, I'm using a MacBook, so my Excel may look a little bit different in terms of where the header is, but other than that, we've compared it with Windows, and more or less all the operations function the same way, at least the ones I'm going to demonstrate today. And the menu more or less looks the same as well. So you should be able to translate this just as well into what you're doing on your computers if you don't have an Apple computer. So the other thing I want to mention is that we're basically going to start off with a sample of, just using kind of a simplified data set, and then get into actual bills of material. The reason for that is I want to declutter some of the things related to the bill of material. So we're going to start off with a very basic example. And so you should now be able to see the Excel file, and you'll see over here in column A, the data set we're going to work with is Nobel Prize winners, right? So you can see over here in the first column, and all of the tabs are going to be really set up this way, where we'll have some data that we're working with in gray on the left-hand side, and then in column B is where we're actually going to do the work. And so the first thing that I want to show you and is going to be related to substitutions. And the way this applies is sometimes you'll have a character or something like that in your Excel file that you want to replace. The best example of that usually is a lot of customers will put in like an asterisk or something like that, where they meant to say that this can be a wildcard towards the end of the part. Well, if you do a find and replace, what happens is it interprets that asterisk to mean that it can be anything. And so it'll actually replace all of your text, and you don't want to do that. So that's where a formula approach works a lot better. So let's do that here. The objective on this sample data set is to replace this underscore, which is at various points in the middle of the text, with just a space. And again, right now we're working with a sample data set, And then once we go through each of these formulas in the sample data set, then we're going to get into actually working a real bill of material using the same concepts that we learned with the sample data set. So the way that we would do this is that we're going to create a formula, and it's called a substitution formula. So I'm going to put an equal sign and write substitute and put a parenthesis. And any formula that you do in Excel will start off with, typically it'll be equal sign and then the name of that formula. And as you type, you should see that there is little indicators down here of what you're supposed to put in each one. And so you'll get used to interpreting what that means. So here it's saying text. So we just want to reference the text that we are pulling from. So I'm going to click over here. I could type in A3 if I wanted to, and it'll point to that cell, or I can just use my mouse and I can click here as well. Either way, same thing. The next thing is it's saying, okay, what is the old text that you want to find? And then what we're going to do is we're going to look at the new text that we want to replace it with. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say I want to replace the underscore. Now, I can't just put in an underscore just like this because Excel doesn't know what to do with that. Anytime you're dealing with text, you want to put it in between two quotation marks. So I'm going to say quotation underscore quotation. And that means it's going to look for a text value that is an underscore. And then we're going to replace it with a space value. And again, I can't just put in a space. I'm going to put quotation, space, quotation, and that's it. Now, the other thing here is it says instance number, and it has it in brackets. When it's in brackets like this, that means it's an optional field and we don't have to populate it. So in this case, I'm not going to populate it. I'm just going to close the parenthesis. And that is the complete version of my formula. When I push enter, you'll see that it has taken this right here and taken the underscore out and replaced it with a space. Now I could do the same thing if I wanted to. I could say take this old text and replace the underscore with, let's say the letter X. And if I do that, now it's replaced it with an X. So you can really do a find and replace anything, anything you wanted to from one to a different substitution. The other thing I want to point out here is if I want to apply this all the way to all the data that I have, usually on the bottom right, you'll see this tiny little square at the bottom right corner of my cell. And when I hover over it, it gives me these crosshairs. I can just double click when I turn into the crosshairs. Whoops, missed it. There we go. And what that does is it just copies the formula all the way down until the bottom of my data set. So now you can see with the substitution function, I've gotten to be able to replace the underscore with a space. Okay. Now I'm going to move on to the second tab. So in this example, what we're going to do is we have a full name over here for all of our Nobel Prize winners. And what I want to do is I want to separate it into a first name and a last name. So I have a separated field here. I've got the full name here, and I want to separate it by first name and last name. And the way I can do that is I could do it through a formula, but an easier way to do that is something called a text to column function. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how the text to column function works. So the first thing I want to do is I want to highlight all of my data sets. So I highlighted here from B3 to the bottom, which is B34. And the next thing I want to do is I'm going to click on the data tab over here at the top. And then from the data tab, there is a field here called text to column. And not sure if you can see it too well on the screen sharing here, but what it's showing you is that there is text over here in the icon, and then it's converting that into multiple columns over here on the right-hand side. So that's what I want to click. So I'm going to click that. Now there's two different options when you are doing text to column. So you can do it delimited, which means that it's going to separate it based on a particular character, or you can do it fixed width. If I do fixed width, basically what I would be doing is I would be saying, I want to separate it into a separate cell every 5 characters or every 10 characters or something like that. But in this case, because my first name could be very long or it could be very short, I don't want to necessarily do it based on a set number of characters. So I'm going to use this delimited option and figure out which character lets me separate it. So I'm going to click delimited and click next. And instead of other over here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that my data is separated by a space. So it's first name, space, last name. So I'm going to select the space option. And you can see a preview down here at the bottom where it's showing me that I've got my first name, and then there's a line, and then my last name. So that's what the space option here would do. If I didn't have spaces and I had commas, then I could use comma. If I had some other character, I could use some other character. Doesn't really matter as long as I use something and the preview reflects how I'd want that data to be separated. Where it says treat consecutive delimiters as one, what that basically means is every once in a while you'll have something where you have two spaces. And do you want it to treat that as, data, space, space, and then the next thing? Or do you want it to just treat consecutive delimiters as one, meaning combine those multiple spaces into just equaling one space? So at least from most bills of material, this is something that you would probably want to check mark. I'm going to click next. And then here you're just describing what the destination data format is going to be. So is it a text, is it date, and so on. So I'm going to say it's text. And then you're going to define the destination. And the destination here, by default, it'll actually keep it in the cell that you started in. So what it would do is it would take this and it would put my first name in this column and then my last name in this column. But I don't want to do that. So I want to change the destination. Instead of B3, I want it to be C3. And that way it'll start to put it here and then go across that way. Okay, so I've got it set as C3. I'm going to click finish. It's going to say, do you want to replace the contents of the selected cells, which is fine with me. And there you go. Now I've converted my full name into first and last names all the way down for the data that I had selected. Okay. As I continue going through this, one other thing that I want to point out is I'd really like this to be as valuable as possible for you guys. So if you have a bill of material that you have been struggling with, this is something that I'm trying a little bit new. We're going to make it interactive. So if you've got a bill of material that you'd like us to work through as a live example, you can go ahead and send it to support@CalcuQuote.com. Again, that's support@CalcuQuote.com. And at the end of the webinar, if there's some time left over, what we're going to do is we're actually going to go through a live bill of material example so that everybody can see how we can apply these tools that we're learning towards a bill of material that is a real world scenario. The only qualifier I would put on there is that the session is being recorded. So if you send us anything, make sure you strip it of any confidential information because you're going to be sharing it with the several other people that are on the call right now. Okay, now I'm going to move on to the next activity here, which is conditional formatting. So we're over here and we've separated the full name into first and last name. And what I want to do now is I want to figure out, are there duplicated first names here? So for example, whoops. Okay, as mentioned, I want to figure out what the duplicated first names are. And so rather than going through each one and saying, okay, I've got two Wilhelms and then I have to keep going down, I've got an Otto here and then one further down. Instead, I just want to highlight all of my duplicated first names. The way I would do that is I can highlight my data set like this. And then once I've highlighted it, I can click on the Home tab and click on Conditional Formatting and highlight cell rules. And here you can define all kinds of different rules. So you can have, if it was a number, I could say highlight anything greater than the number 5, or I could say less than. But the one I want to do is I want to do duplicated values here. So I'm going to click duplicated values. And when I do that, it's saying, how do you want to format it, right? So I'm going to highlight it red. I can change my options here if I want to. Doesn't really matter to me. I'm going to highlight it green. Okay, and when I do that, I'm going to click OK. And just so you can read it, it says format only unique or duplicated values. That's duplicate. Values in the selected range. Format with green text. So I'm going to say OK. When I do that, now it's highlighted for me everywhere where there is a duplicated value. The nice thing about this is that it is dynamic. So if I were to go in and change something, for example, and just change that name, now it removed the highlighting from both places because it says this is no longer duplicated. Similarly, if I were to create a duplicate, then it would highlight that for me again to say that you have a duplicated value. This can be really helpful if you're trying to identify in a bill of material where there are duplicated values so that you can remove those or consolidate those into one line item. Okay, next thing we're talking about here is the Vlookup. This is something that eludes a lot of people, but a lot of people are also very familiar with it. So what a Vlookup is, if you've not heard of it before, is a way to be able to look up information that is in your current data set from a separate data set. So for example, in this case, if I wanted to, I could look up the full name of the Nobel laureate and say, I want to know what subject did they get it in and which year did they get that Nobel Prize in. So the way I would do that is I have a data set over here that shows me who was the Nobel winner and a Nobel Prize winner, what subject and what year, and I want to populate that information into here next to these guys. So there's a couple different ways I could do it, right? The first way is I could say, okay, I've got this guy, and there's no way I'm going to pronounce that name correctly, but I've got this person, and I could go over here and look and say, okay, I've got, here he is, or she is, and they got it in chemistry, and I'm going to copy and paste that over here. And I could do that for every single one in this list, but that would be a very tedious thing. And so instead, what I want to do is I want to look up automatically the full name of this person, find it in this list, and tell me what is next to it. And that's what Vlookup does. So the way you structure a Vlookup query, similar to the substitution formula, we're going to put an equal sign, and then I'm going to put Vlookup, and usually it will autocomplete for you as you start to type. So it can do that. And then after that, it's saying, okay, first thing is, what is the lookup value? This is asking me, what is it that I'm trying to look up? So I'm trying to look up the name, the full name of the Nobel Prize winner. So I'm going to click on that. And then it's saying, what is the table array? Meaning, where do I look this up from? So in this case, I've got it right here next to my original data, but you could have it in a separate Excel file or on a separate tab. It doesn't matter. Wherever you are that you have that information is where you would go to, and then you would just go and select, highlight the entire data set for yourself. Okay, so now I've highlighted that. I'm going to put a comma, and then it's saying column index number. So if you think of this data set as having columns, so I've got column 1, column 2, and column 3, they want to know which field do you want to return. Well, I want to return the subject, which in this case is in column 2. So I'm going to put the number 2. And then there's this range lookup value, and almost always I would say that you want to put in false. In this case, it's an optional value, but I always put in false because it gives you an exact match. Otherwise, it has some other algorithm that it matches by. So I'm going to put in false and hit enter, now that my formula is complete. And there you go. Now it's looked up that Robert Koch over here got his Nobel Prize in medicine. And I can validate that by going over here, and I can see that yes, in fact, it was in medicine. The other thing that we might want to do is you want to make sure that this data stays rigid. So for example, if I were to copy this formula down, what it does, unfortunately, is that it shifted my table down, right? So if I look at this one right here, it's highlighted all the way from row 1 down to, what is that, row 52 or 51. But instead, I want to have it stay on row 1 to 51. And so the way I'm going to do that is you can use dollar signs. And dollar signs basically make this from a dynamic reference to a fixed reference. And what I mean by that is it will not change as you go down. So for example, if I put a dollar sign in front of B, then that means that even if I were to copy this formula to the right, it will maintain that reference for me, right? So it's still pointing to B. But over here, you can see that it shifted it to the right. So I don't want it to shift it to the right. So now let's put the dollar signs also in front of H and J. And now when I copy it to the right, you can see that it kept it in place horizontally. I want to do the same thing for the vertical. So if I copy this down and keep going down, whoops, then you can see that it's starting to shift my table down as I copy the formula down. So I don't want to do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put dollar signs in front of the row indicators as well. And now when I do that and copy it down, it's going to keep the same table reference all the way through. So now I can copy this formula into all of these cells, and you can see that it populated everywhere. The other thing I want to do is here, I've got subjects, but instead I wanted to have the year because this is the year column. And so I can go into my formula, and where I'm referencing column number 2, which was subject, I'm going to change it to column number 3. And when I do that, now I'm going to get my year back instead of my subject. Okay. This might be a good stopping point. If you do have any questions, feel free to use the Q&A to ask any questions you may have. We're happy to answer those. We have people standing by, and we can also get into things after the webinar as well, or you can always reach out to us. I think most of you know how to get a hold of us, but go to our website, you'll see a way to contact us there, and we can get into more details as well. So now we've gone through some basic examples of using formulas and Excel functions in a theoretical example of Nobel Prize winners. We're going to get into how we apply these same concepts to bills of material. And so let's go into the next tab here, which is substitution as applied to a bill of material. So I can't do a quick show of hands here, but I assume that most of you have gotten a bill of material where you've gotten cells that look like this, where the manufacturer part numbers are separated by carriage returns or line breaks or whatever you want to call it, enters within the cell. So all your part numbers are in one cell rather than having them neatly divided into separate cells. And the question more often than not is, how do I separate these cells into something that I can now work with and do, copy and paste or upload into whatever system I'm working with or so on. So we're going to use the same substitution formula that we had done before to apply it to these cells. So let me show you how that works. So we're going to apply substitute formula here, and then I'm going to reference the cell that is containing my text. So it's A3 right now. And then I'm going to say, what is the old text? Well, the old text here is an enter. I can't just push enter or something like that to get it to understand what I'm trying to do. So instead, I'm going to actually reference the character. And the character for a carriage return is character 13, which you may or may not know, but it's a nice thing to just memorize. So I'm just going to put character 13, and that means carriage return in Excel world. And if you ever get confused about which character to actually reference, you can always look it up. If you go to Google, it's a great source, but there's a lot of different characters out there, special characters especially, that you can use references to using the character formula here. And then I'm going to say, what is my new text? Well, I don't necessarily want to use a space or an underscore because that might create a more confusing thing for me, because I could have a manufacturer space, a manufacturer part number. So I'm just going to pick something that is completely, completely off the wall, that there's no way it could be in the bill of material. So I'm going to put a tilde like this. So wherever it finds this carriage return, it's going to replace it with a tilde, and now I'm going to push enter. And you can see what it did here is it took the chemet part right here, and then it put two tildes because I've got a line break to get to this next row, and then another one to get to the third row. So I put two tildes here. Similarly, I can copy this formula down, and you can see what it's done is it's replaced the line breaks with a tilde. Now that I've got all of my data in one row, instead of having carriage returns, now I can actually use text to columns, which is what we're going to cover next, to split these cells into separate columns. Okay, so now I'm going to click on text to columns. So here what we want to do is we've got some values over here that are separated by some character. It doesn't have to be a tilde, it can be something else, but the point here is I've got a bunch of manufacturer part numbers and I want to split them into columns. So I've got manufacturer part number 1, 2, 3, and 4, and that's what I want to separate it into. So we're going to use the text to column function. So I'm going to click on data, I'm going to click on text to columns, and then I'm going to click on delimited because it's going to be delimited by something. And then I'm going to say, instead of space, I'm going to say that it's delimited by that tilde character. And this, again, is a good example of why we want to treat consecutive delimiters as one, because otherwise I would have blank spaces in the middle here where I didn't want to. So I'm going to say treat consecutives as one. There we go. And then I also want to point it as the destination to start over here so that it doesn't override my original data. I'm going to click Finish and click OK. And there we go. Now I've got, in each cell, I've got my manufacturer and manufacturer part number separated out so that I don't have to manually go through and split each of these by myself. Now that I've got it separated out, I want to show you how the conditional formatting would also apply to this case. So what I can do is, if I want to identify where the same part number is being used more than once, I can highlight my data set, click on Home, click on Conditional Formatting, click on Highlight Cell Rules, and click on Duplicate Values. And when I do that, I'm going to click OK. I'm OK with it looking red, and I'm going to click OK. And now you can see that it is highlighted that I've got the same part number appearing on two different cells here. So this might be an error, or it might be something that was intentional. Not sure. This is a fake BOM. Okay, so now the next thing we're going to talk about is it's great to have it like this, but sometimes you want to have your columns be turned into rows. So I've got, for example, let me go over to this next tab. So what we're looking at here is I've got 4 manufacturer part numbers in this row right here, but I don't want it to be 4 different columns. Instead, I would like it to be 4 rows referencing the same line item. And so what I'm going to do is I want to convert this into rows. There's a couple different ways to do it, but what we're going to look at here is just using a very simple method of copying and pasting so that it just shifts everything down. So the first thing I want to do is I want to create some kind of reference to these lines. So I'm going to insert the column over here, and I'm going to say that this is my line item number. I'm just going to put 1, 2, 3. And again, using the same concept as before, if I highlight this and I put my cursor on the bottom right, it gives me those black crosshairs. I double click, it just copies that all the way down. So I've got 1 through 9 now consecutively numbered. Once I got those numbers, what I can do is now I've got a reference to my cells. So I'm going to copy all of this and just paste it at the bottom again. Okay, and I'm actually going to do that multiple times. So I'm going to copy and paste and copy and paste. Okay, so now I've copied and pasted it multiple times. And what I want to do now is I want to shift these cells left. So I'm going to say, highlight this, right click, and delete. And it gives me an option here. It says, do you want to shift the cells left, up, delete the entire row, or delete the entire column? I want to shift them left. So what it's going to do is it's going to take the values over here that are in the MPN2 column and move them left. Okay, so I'm going to click OK. And you can see now I've got my MPN2 in the same column as MPN1. I'm going to do the same thing further down. So I'm going to shift 2 to the left now. So I'm going to right click, delete, click OK. Now it's shifted 2 to the left. And then I'm going to do the same thing over here. So I've got 3 to the left. And shift to the left. There we go. Okay. And now all of these are duplicates. I'm just going to go ahead and delete this. And this is no longer my MPN1 column. It's just my MPN column. Okay. Now you might be thinking to yourself here, well, I've got all these blank spaces. What am I supposed to do with that? Plus all these rows. So what we're going to do is we're just going to apply a really basic filter here. And so I'm going to select all of my data here. And once I select it, I'm going to put in a filter. So I'm going to say filter. And over here, I'm going to select, let's see. Where's my filter not working? Oh, that's strange. Oh, you know what? That might be because, give me 1 second. Here we go. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to filter for things like MPN1 or MPN2 or so on. So showing up on a different monitor for me is, I think, what the problem is. And it's tucked behind the webinar thing. Okay, so let me see if I can drag this up. Okay, there we go. So this is what it looks like when you click the filter. And what I want to do is I want to filter for blanks, which I'm going to want to remove. And I'm going to filter for these column header rows. Okay, so now I've got those filters. I'm going to click close. And all I have to do now is highlight all of these rows, right click, and delete the row. And then I'll just remove the filter. And there we go. Now I've got my bill of material with no blank spaces. My final step is going to be to bring all those part numbers together again. So I'm going to sort this by the line item, and I'm going to say sort it ascending. And there we go. Now I've got line item 1 right here with the 3 part numbers, and I've got line item 2 together, and I've got line item 3 together, and 4, and so on. Okay. Again, if you have any questions about this, feel free to use the Q&A, the chat, to ask. Otherwise, we're also happy to talk to you about this afterwards. Okay, so now we've got the columns to rows thing figured out. Next, we're going to talk about Vlookup for bills of material. So Vlookup comes in handy in a lot of different situations for bills of material. A couple different scenarios that we see is looking up internal part numbers or descriptions from a separate data set. Also matching customer part numbers to manufacturer part numbers can be a big one. There's a variety of cases where you might want to use it. What we're going to use it for here today is to actually check a multi-level bill of material. So in this case, I have a bill of material that has parent assemblies with sub-assemblies inside of them. And so what I want to do is I want to validate that in fact I do have this parent bill of material in my bill of material overall. So the way I would do that is, I'm going to just delete this formula here. I'm going to do a Vlookup. So I'm going to say equals Vlookup. And then I'm going to say, what is my lookup value? So what is the value that I want to validate exists or not? So I'm going to say, this is the value I want to check. And then I'm going to say, where am I looking it up from? Well, this is the camera assembly, and I want to look it up from this column. So I'm going to select this column. And then because it's only a one column table array, I'm just going to say 1 right here. And I'm going to put in that false so that it uses the exact match. When I push enter, okay, so you can see I'm getting an error message here. And so the reason I'm getting an error message is that it did not find any match. So if I were to copy the same formula down, it returned back camera assembly and said, yes, I found this over here, but it did not find this. Well, it looks like there's a spelling mistake. There's an extra S in here. So if I fix this, there you go. And that's how I know that this is now a valid parent part number. So I can do that all the way through wherever I see a parent part number and start to get a good idea of whether I have a valid BOM. Oh, so I found another example here. This one says main PCBs. Well, instead I probably wanted it to say main PCB. So I'm going to change that, remove the S, and there we go. Now I know that I've got valid parent part numbers in my bill of material. Okay. The next thing we're going to talk about is filling blank rows. So I'm going to switch over to this section right here. So this is an example bill of material, and I'm sure some of you have seen this in the past where I've got line item level information here, and then the customer or whoever you got the BOM from has put manufacturer part numbers into separate rows. Well, this makes it very confusing to read, and I'd really just like it to be where all of this information is populated all the way down. Okay. And so I want to fill in all of these blank rows with the information that applies to this part number so that I don't lose track if I ever sort or filter or something like that. I don't lose track of what this part number belongs to. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to highlight our entire data set right here. So I'm going to start here and highlight all the way to here. Okay, so it's selected everything that I want to fill in with blank, fill in where there are blanks. And then I'm going to push, this is just a keyboard shortcut, and one of the things that I would strongly encourage is start to force yourself to use keyboard shortcuts as soon as you learn them, because then you force a habit of it. And then, you know, at some point you'll get to the point where you don't even know where to find it in terms of the menu path because you're just so quick at using the keyboard shortcuts. So the keyboard shortcut for this is F5. When I push F5, it gives me this go-to box right here. And I don't have any special references, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on special. When I click on special, it gives me a bunch of different options on what I want to select. And I want to select all the blank cells. And you can see there's a lot of other options here. So I can select formulas, I can select arrays, I can select different columns. If I'm selecting formulas, I can find out what the precedent is, etc. But I'm going to select blank cells, and I'm going to click OK. When I select blank cells, you can see now it's highlighted these and these, but not the ones that are yellow. And then what I want to do is I want to push the equal sign and reference the cell directly above it. So I'm in this cell right here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to reference A2 because I'm currently on A3. Okay. Now, if I push enter, what that would do is it would just apply that formula into one place. But instead, what I want to do is I'm going to push equals, reference the cell above it, and then push on a Windows computer, it would be Control Enter. On a Mac, it's Command Enter. But when I push that, it's going to apply that same formula into all of my selected cells. And now you can see here I've got a formula everywhere, but it's basically just referencing the cell above it. So it's still accurate in the sense that it's copied all the information down. Okay, so that's how you can get blank cells filled in a structure like this, where you have a line item with blank rows below it. Okay. And then the final thing that I'm going to go over here is how to combine part numbers and quantities to make sure that you are consolidating wherever possible. So here I have a relatively simple example. I've got a bill of material, and we're going to call it the alpha BOM and the beta BOM, which is right here. Okay, and both of these are something that I want to combine so that I'm getting advantage of combined quantities. And what I've done is I've highlighted duplicate values right here. So you can see I do have some duplicates in my BOM. So for example, this part appears right here. This part appears right here. And so what I would want to do ideally is, rather than quoting 2 pieces here and 2 pieces here, I want to combine it, make it 4 pieces, and get the volume pricing for 4 instead of 2. So the way I would do this is, first thing I want to do is I want to highlight my data set like I always do. So I'm going to select all of that. And then I'm going to click on the Insert tab, and we're going to use pivot tables. And if you haven't used pivot tables before, it's something that is an extremely, extremely powerful tool within Excel to be able to consolidate data, group it, or filter it in really dynamic ways. The way we're going to do it today is we're going to consolidate by the manufacturer part number. So I'm going to click on Pivot Table right here. And instead of putting in a new worksheet, I'm just going to put it in the existing worksheet. I'm going to put it right over here. So it's telling me that this is going to be my table range right here. I'm going to click OK. And now it's given me a little dialog box that says, okay, here's my pivot table builder, and this is where my pivot table is going to end up. Now it's just a matter of building out what my table is going to have in it. So for example, I need to define what are going to be the rows, what are going to be the columns, and what are going to be the values within those columns. So the first thing I want to do is I want to have rows for manufacturer and manufacturer part number. So I'm going to click over here, and I can just drag and drop. So I'm going to drag manufacturer into rows, and it gives me all of my manufacturers right here. Second thing I want to do is drag my manufacturer part number and put it into rows. And now I've got, for each manufacturer, I've got all the manufacturer part numbers within it as well. And then the final thing I want to do is take the quantity and make that the value that I want to sum. So I'm going to drag that over here into values. And when I do that, now I should have the consolidated, it says sum of quantity over here. So let's take an example. I've got this Diodes Inc. part right here, which is 2N7002, and I've got a quantity of 2 and a quantity of 2. If I find the same part over here, you can see that it's got 4 in its place. Similarly, I could take this one as an example. I've got 5, and then I've got 3. So if I were to find that manufacturer down here, you can see I've got 5 and 3 equals 8. Okay, so it's consolidated that. Now this is not a format that might really work well for you. And so the other thing I want to point out is you can always reshape what the pivot table looks like. So I'm going to go into design over here. I'm going to change the report layout. So instead of this layout, I always prefer either the tabular layout or the outline layout. I'm going to click on tabular here so you can see an example of that. Okay, now I've got everything in a more stable table format, but I have these annoying little totals in the middle that are going to make my data really annoying. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove subtotals. So it's going to say don't show subtotals right here. And now I've got it in a much cleaner data structure for my consolidated view. If, for example, I wanted to know what the BOM is that is using these part numbers, I could always put in a row for BOM. So I can go in here and I can say BOM, and now I've got it broken out. So again, let's find that Diodes Inc. part. You can see it's got this part number and then alpha and beta and 2 and 2. But I can always collapse this. So I can click this little minus sign right here and it turns it into plus and it consolidates it into 4. Or I can go over here into pivot table analysis. And I can just say collapse this field and it'll collapse it everywhere. I'm going to click collapse field and there you go. Now it's collapsed everywhere. It also gives me my grand total down here at the bottom, so I know I have 115 components. Other ways you could use this is if you had part classification, you could group it by different part classes and things like that. A lot of different dynamic options here in how you combine different things in a table structure. The only caveat to that is you do have to have it in a table structure like this. You can't have blank headers and blank cells in the middle. It has to be a clean data set for you to be able to work with it. Okay, so that kind of covers the plans that I had for today. What I'd like to do now is I'm going to first check to see if we had anybody volunteer to share a bill of material. Did we have anybody share it? No? Okay, that's fine. And I can completely understand that. You might have some sensitive customer information that you don't want to share on a webinar like this. Totally understand. What I'll leave the door open with is that if you ever want to talk about either how to better use Excel for your purposes or how to, I work at CalcuQuote, so if you want to talk about how to improve your quoting processes, either way, feel free to reach out to us through our website. It's just www.calcuquote.com, and we'd be happy to talk to you. Thank you very much for your time, and we look forward to talking to you next month.